The dust from the wagon train had barely settled when Emma Katherine collapsed face first into the red Utah dirt, her body convulsing with chills, despite the brutal afternoon sun beating down on St. George's unforgiving landscape. She had felt the sickness creeping through her bones for 2 days, dismissing it as exhaustion from the endless journey west. But now her vision swam with dark spots, and her skin burned like she had been thrown into a furnace. The other travelers gathered around her prone form, their faces twisted with fear and something worse, something that made her stomach clench even through the fever haze. She heard the murmurs, the concerned whispers that were really just thinly veiled panic about contagion, about delays, about how they could not afford to stop when winter would be nipping at their heels before they reached California. Benjamin Harris watched from his horse as the circle of people around the fallen woman grew tighter, then began to disperse. He had been riding alongside the wagon train for 3 days now, hired as extra security after a Paiute raid had spooked the wagon master near the Arizona border. At 26, he had spent half his life on horseback, drifting from one job to another across the territories, never staying long enough to put down roots or form attachments that might anchor him to one place. His calloused hands knew the weight of a rifle better than they knew tenderness, and his heart had grown as weathered as the leather saddle beneath him. But something about the way the woman had fallen, the way her body had simply given up its fight to remain upright, stirred an old memory in him of his younger sister dying of scarlet fever when he was just 15. He had watched his mother sit with her for days, never leaving her side, and he had learned then that sometimes the difference between life and death was simply having someone refuse to let you slip away alone. He dismounted and pushed through the remaining onlookers, kneeling beside Emma just as the wagon master, a grizzled man named Horace Cunningham, was pronouncing his verdict. "We cannot risk it spreading. We will leave her with supplies and pray the Lord sees fit to deliver her, but this train moves out within the hour." "You cannot just leave her here to die," Benjamin said, his voice low but carrying an edge that made several people step back. "We have 37 souls depending on reaching California before the mountain passes close. I will not risk them for one woman who is likely already beyond help." Horace's face was hard, carved from years of making impossible choices on impossible trails. Emma's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Please," she whispered, the single word taking all her remaining strength. Her chestnut hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her lips had already started to crack from dehydration. She was perhaps 23 or 24, Benjamin guessed, with delicate features that spoke of an Eastern upbringing, the kind of woman who probably had never imagined she would die alone in the Utah desert when she had first set out on this journey. "I will stay with her," Benjamin heard himself say, the words coming out before his mind had fully processed the decision. "You all go on. I will catch up when she is well enough to travel, or I will bury her proper if she is not." Horace studied him for a long moment, calculating. "Your choice, Harris, but I cannot pay you for days you are not riding with us. I am not asking you to." The wagon master nodded curtly and turned away, already shouting orders to prepare for departure. The other travelers scattered like startled quail, relieved to have the problem solved in a way that did not require them to compromise their own survival. Within an hour, as promised, the wagon train was nothing but dust on the western horizon, and Benjamin was alone with a dying woman in the shade of a scraggly juniper tree on the outskirts of St. George. He worked quickly in those first hours, setting up a proper camp that would serve them for however long this took. There was a small creek about a quarter-mile east, barely more than a trickle this late in the summer of 1873, but enough to keep them in water if he was careful. He erected a canvas shelter to keep the worst of the sun off Emma, then fashioned a crude travois in case he needed to move her closer to the water source. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words he could not quite make out, sometimes crying out in what sounded like terror. By nightfall of that first day, her fever had climbed even higher. Benjamin had seen enough sickness in his years to know she was in serious trouble. He stripped off her travel-stained dress, trying to maintain what modesty he could while recognizing that propriety meant nothing if she died of heat stroke. He soaked cloths in the cool creek water and laid them across her forehead, her wrists, the back of her neck. Her skin was so hot it seemed to steam when the wet fabric touched it. "My name is Benjamin," he told her during one of her brief, lucid moments. "You are going to be all right. I am not leaving." Her fever-bright eyes found his face and seemed to focus for just a second. "Emma," she breathed. "Emma Katherine." Then she was gone again, lost in whatever burning landscape her mind had conjured. He sat with her through that first night, keeping the fire going to ward off the chill that crept down from the red cliffs surrounding them, constantly refreshing the cooling cloths, forcing water between her cracked lips drop by precious drop. He had made a promise, not to her but to himself, and Benjamin Harris might have been a drifter and a hired gun, but he had never broken his word. The second day was worse. Emma's fever burned so high that her body shook with convulsions, her back arching off the bedroll he had laid her on. He held her down gently but firmly, afraid she would injure herself in her thrashing. She cried out names he did not recognize, called for her mother, begged someone named Thomas to forgive her. Benjamin pieced together fragments of her story from these fever dreams. She had been engaged to a man back in Boston, had broken it off and joined the wagon train west, seeking a fresh start, seeking freedom from expectations that had been suffocating her since childhood. Her parents had disowned her for the scandal of it, for refusing a match that would have secured their social standing. "You were brave to leave," he told her, not knowing if she could hear him. "That took more courage than most people ever find." He hunted in the early morning hours, before the heat became unbearable, bringing down a jackrabbit that he turned into a thin broth. Getting her to swallow any of it was a battle, but he persisted, knowing she would need whatever strength she could get. Her body was consuming itself, burning through every reserve trying to fight off whatever sickness had taken root in her. The third day brought no improvement. If anything, Emma seemed to be slipping further away. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid, and the periods when she regained any awareness became fewer and briefer. Benjamin found himself talking to her constantly, as if his voice alone could tether her to the world of the living. He told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the sister he had lost, and how it had set him on this rootless path. He told her things he had never spoken aloud to anyone, secrets that seemed safer to share with someone who might not remember hearing them. "You have to fight," he said, gripping her hand. Her fingers were so hot they nearly burned him. "I have seen people survive worse than this. You just have to hold on." But he was not sure he believed his own words anymore. He had seen that grayish tint creeping into her skin, had felt her pulse growing thready and weak. He began to prepare himself for the likelihood that he would be digging a grave before the week was out. The fourth day was when something shifted in Benjamin himself. Somewhere in the endless cycle of cooling her fever, forcing water and broth between her lips, holding her through the convulsions and the nightmares, he had become invested in her survival in a way that went beyond simple human decency. He studied her face during the moments when sleep brought her some peace, memorizing the curve of her cheekbone, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her fevered cheeks. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a determination in her, even in her unconscious state, a refusal to simply give up that called to something in his own battered soul. He realized he was praying, something he had not done since his sister died. The words felt rusty and awkward, but they came anyway, desperate bargains with a God he was not sure he still believed in. Let her live, and I will be a better man. Let her live, and I will stop drifting. Let her live, and I will give her whatever life she was seeking when she set out on that wagon train. That night, her fever spiked to terrifying heights. Her whole body seized, rigid as a board, and a sound came from her throat that was barely human. Benjamin held her, his own tears falling onto her burning skin as he was certain he was about to watch her die in his arms. He pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, "Please do not go. Please, Emma. I know we are strangers, but please do not leave me here alone." The seizure passed, leaving her limp and gasping. He held her for hours afterward, afraid to let go, afraid that if he released her she would simply float away. His arms ached and his back cramped, but he did not move. The night stretched into eternity, measured only by her labored breaths and the crackling of the fire. The fifth day dawned with no change. Emma's fever remained dangerously high, though the convulsions had stopped. Benjamin was exhausted, running on perhaps 6 hours of sleep total over the past 4 days. His eyes burned and his hands trembled from fatigue, but he could not rest. He made another trip to the creek, refilling his canteens and soaking fresh cloths. A pair of Mormon settlers passed by on the road, eyeing his camp with suspicion. He asked if they had any medicine, any herbs that might help break a fever, but they hurried on, clearly wanting no part of whatever sickness had laid claim here. He was on his own, as he had always been. But this time, he was not alone. That distinction felt important somehow. Benjamin found himself studying Emma's hands during one of his vigils, noting the calluses on her fingers that suggested she had done her share of work on the wagon train, that she had not been content to simply ride while others toiled. She had been trying to earn her place, to prove she could survive in this harsh new world she had chosen. He admired that. Too many people, especially women from eastern cities, came west expecting it to bend to their will, expecting the territory to be tamed by their mere presence. Emma had understood that she would need to change, to adapt, to become someone new. If she lived, what would she do? The wagon train was long gone, and even if he could track them down, would she want to rejoin people who had abandoned her so readily? The question circled in his mind as he tended to her, as he dripped water between her parched lips and wiped the sweat from her brow. The 6th day began with a sandstorm rolling in from the west, the wind whipping the red Utah dust into stinging clouds. Benjamin secured the canvas shelter as best he could, but fine grit still found its way into everything, coating Emma's skin and his own, getting into their eyes and mouths. He curled his body around hers, using himself as a shield against the worst of it, and waited for the storm to pass. It lasted 3 hours, howling like something alive and angry, and when it finally moved on, the entire camp was buried under a thin layer of rust-colored sand. He cleaned Emma carefully, wiping away the dust, checking to make sure none of it had gotten into her mouth or nose in dangerous quantities. Her fever continued to rage, unbroken and merciless. 6 days now. He had heard of fevers lasting a week or more, but he had also heard that the longer they burned, the less likely recovery became. The body could only endure so much. That evening, as the sun painted the red cliffs in shades of amber and gold, Emma opened her eyes with something approaching clarity for the first time in days. She looked at Benjamin, really looked at him and whispered, "You are real. I thought you were a dream." His heart nearly burst at those simple words. "I am real. You are going to be all right." "So thirsty," she breathed. He lifted her head gently, supporting it with one hand while he held a canteen to her lips with the other. She drank greedily, and he had to slow her down, knowing too much water too fast would make her sick. When she had finished, her eyes were already drifting closed again, but there was a ghost of a smile on her cracked lips. "Thank you," she murmured, and then sleep claimed her once more. It was the first time she had truly acknowledged him, the first sign that the woman he was fighting so hard to save still existed somewhere beneath the fever. Benjamin allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. The seventh day brought a new challenge. Emma's fever, while still dangerously high, seemed to have reached a plateau rather than continuing to climb. But she had developed a terrible cough, deep and wet, that racked her whole body. Pneumonia, Benjamin feared, a common complication of high fevers. He elevated her head and shoulders, knowing that lying flat would make it worse, and brewed a tea from wild sage he had found growing near the creek. His mother had sworn by it for lung ailments, though he had no idea if it would actually help. Getting her to drink the tea was difficult. She choked on it, coughing so violently he thought she might crack a rib. But he persisted, and eventually she managed to get most of it down. He sat behind her, supporting her weight against his chest, feeling each labored breath she took as if it were his own. They stayed like that for hours, and he found himself memorizing the weight of her, the way she fit against him as though some divine hand had designed them to match. It was a dangerous line of thinking. She was sick, vulnerable, dependent on him for her very survival. Any feelings he might be developing were inappropriate at best, exploitative at worst. And yet, he could not deny that something had taken root in his chest over these 7 days, something that grew stronger each time she fought her way back to brief consciousness, each time she managed another sip of water or broth. He had spent so many years deliberately not caring, not letting anyone matter enough to hurt him when they inevitably left or died. And now here he was, terrified of losing a woman whose last name he had learned from her fever dreams, whose laugh he had never heard, whose smile he had only glimpsed once in a moment of semi-consciousness. The 8th day was the longest of Benjamin's life. Emma's condition seemed to teeter on a knife's edge, neither improving nor worsening in any definitive way. Her fever remained stubbornly high, her cough continued to rattle in her chest, but she also had moments of lucidity that lasted a few minutes rather than a few seconds. During one of these moments, she asked him why he had stayed. "I could not leave you," he said simply, "because it was the truth even if it was not the whole truth. You do not know me. I could be a terrible person." Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from days of fever and coughing. "Terrible people do not thank strangers for giving them water," he replied. "And they do not cry for their mothers in their sleep or worry about the people they left behind." "You heard that?" She looked mortified. What little color was in her cheeks deepening. "I heard a lot of things. None of them made me think any less of you." She studied his face with eyes that, while still fever-bright, held more awareness than they had in a week. "I cannot pay you for this. I have almost nothing to my name. I am not asking to be paid." "Then why?" He struggled to find words that would make sense, that would not sound insane or inappropriate. "Because everyone deserves to have someone sit with them in the darkness. And because I have been running from ghosts for too long, and maybe saving you is the first step toward stopping." Emma reached out with one trembling hand and touched his face, her fingers barely grazing his bearded jaw. "I do not even know your full name." "Benjamin Harris. And I know you are Emma Katherine, late of Boston, running toward freedom and away from a man named Thomas who never deserved you. A weak laugh escaped her, cut short by a coughing fit. When it passed, she said, "You really did hear everything. Everything that mattered." She fell asleep again shortly after, but Benjamin felt the shift in her, some fundamental change that made him believe, truly believe, that she might survive this. He held her hand through the night, feeling her pulse against his thumb, steady and strong despite everything. The 9th day arrived with the desert dawn, golden light spilling across the red rocks and painting the world in shades of copper and bronze. Benjamin had dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to check on Emma, to make sure she was still breathing. Around mid-morning, as he was preparing another dose of sage tea, he noticed something different. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead and his breath caught. The fever had broken. Emma's skin was still warm, but it was the warmth of exertion rather than the terrifying heat that had been consuming her. Her breathing was easier, her color better. As if sensing his scrutiny, her eyes opened, and for the first time since she had collapsed in the dust 9 days ago, they were clear and focused. "Hello," she said, her voice still rough but recognizably human rather than the fevered rasp he had grown accustomed to. "Hello," he replied, and he could not keep the smile from his face or the relief from his voice. "Welcome back. How long was I gone?" "9 days. You gave me quite a scare, Emma Katherine." She tried to sit up and immediately fell back, weak as a newborn foal. 9 days. The wagon train, they must be halfway to California by now. They left the first day. It was just you and me. Her eyes widened as the implications of that sank in. "You stayed with me for 9 days. You could have died out here yourself or been killed by raiders or any number of things, and you stayed. I told you I would not leave. I meant it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dust and grime that had accumulated there. "I do not understand. Why would you do that for a complete stranger?" Benjamin sat beside her on the bedroll, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Maybe you were a stranger when you fell. But after 9 days of sitting with someone, of learning their fears and their regrets and their dreams from the words they speak when they do not even know they are speaking, well, you do not feel like a stranger anymore." "What did I say?" she asked, looking mortified again. "You said you left Boston because you were tired of being a decoration in someone else's life. You said you wanted to matter, to do something real with your time on this earth. You said you would rather die free in the desert than live in a gilded cage." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You said you were afraid no one would ever really see you, that you would always just be a pretty face to be managed and controlled." Emma covered her face with her hands, but he gently pulled them away. "Do not be embarrassed. Those are good things to want. Important things." "And what about you, Benjamin Harris? What do you want?" It was a fair question, and one he had been asking himself for 9 days as he had watched over her. "I used to think I wanted to never be tied down, to be able to walk away from anything at any moment. But somewhere in the last week I realized I have just been running scared. I want what most people want, I suppose. A reason to stay in one place. A home. Someone to build that home with." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Emma looked at him with those clear eyes, and he saw understanding dawn in them, along with something else, something that made his heart race. "I am weak as a kitten and probably look like something dragged behind a horse for a few miles," she said. "This is hardly the time for such a conversation. I am not saying we need to decide anything right now. I am just telling you the truth. I learned something sitting with you through this, Emma. Life is too short and too uncertain to not be honest about what matters." She nodded slowly. "Then I will be honest too. I have been awake more than you probably realized over these 9 days. not truly conscious but aware in fragments. I heard your voice in the darkness. I felt your hands keeping me cool, forcing me to drink, holding me when I was so afraid I was going to die. And some part of me, even lost in the fever, understood that you were fighting for me when you had no reason to. That means something, Benjamin. That means everything. He helped her sit up slowly, supporting her back, and brought her water and some of the broth he had been making. She drank eagerly, and he could see strength returning to her with each passing hour. They talked as the day wore on, filling in the gaps that fever dreams had left, learning each other properly for the first time. She told him about her childhood in Boston, the suffocating expectations of her social class, the moment she had realized that marrying Thomas would mean slowly disappearing into the role of the dutiful wife, until nothing of her true self remained. She had booked passage on the wagon train with money she had earned herself by secretly working as a seamstress, money her parents had never known about. He told her about Texas, about his family's small ranch that had been destroyed by raiders when he was 17, killing his father and scattering his surviving siblings to the wind. He told her about the years of drifting that had followed, taking jobs as a ranch hand, a guide, a hired gun, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. He told her about his sister, about watching helplessly as fever took her, and about how seeing Emma collapse had brought all those old feelings rushing back. "So you stayed because I reminded you of your sister?" Emma asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested the answer mattered very much. "I stayed because of her at first," Benjamin admitted, "but I kept staying because of you. Because somewhere around the third day, when you called out in your sleep and I answered, and you seemed to calm at the sound of my voice, I realized I did not want to be anywhere else. That terrified me, but it also felt right in a way nothing has felt right in a very long time." Emma reached out and took his hand, her grip still weak but determined. "I am not going to pretend I fell in love with you while I was barely conscious. That would be absurd and the kind of romantic nonsense I left Boston to escape. But I will say that I would very much like the chance to get to know you properly, Benjamin Harris. I would like to see if this feeling, this connection that neither of us can quite explain, is real or just the product of extreme circumstances. That is all I am asking for," he said. "A chance." They spent 3 more days at the camp while Emma recovered her strength. Benjamin hunted and cooked, and Emma helped as much as her returning energy allowed. They talked for hours, discovering shared opinions on everything from politics to poetry, arguing good-naturedly about the best way to cook beans and whether the desert or the mountains held more beauty. Each conversation was a revelation, uncovering compatibilities that felt almost uncanny. They had led such different lives, come from such different worlds, and yet their values aligned in the ways that mattered most. On the 4th day after the fever broke, Emma was finally strong enough to travel. Benjamin had fashioned a more comfortable seat on his horse, padding it with blankets so she could ride without too much discomfort. They headed into St. George proper, the small Mormon settlement that served as a way station for travelers passing through southern Utah. The town was modest but well organized, with neat adobe buildings and irrigated gardens that seemed like miracles in the harsh desert landscape. They found lodging at a boarding house run by a formidable woman named Sister Prudence, who took one look at Emma's weakened state and immediately went into protective mode. She installed Emma in the best room, brought her hearty stew and fresh bread, and subjected Benjamin to a thorough interrogation about his intentions. "I am not running a house of ill repute," Sister Prudence declared, hands on her hips. "If you are traveling with this young woman, you had best be married or related by blood. We are neither, yet, Benjamin said carefully, "but we will be married before we leave St. George if Emma will have me." Emma, who had been resting in the next room, appeared in the doorway with color returning to her cheeks and fire in her eyes. "Benjamin Harris, if that is your idea of a marriage proposal, we need to have a serious discussion about romance." He turned to face her, suddenly nervous in a way that gunfights and cattle stampedes had never made him. "You are right. I apologize." He crossed the room and took both her hands in his. "Emma Katherine, I know we have only known each other for less than 2 weeks, and I know most of that time you were barely conscious. I know this is fast and probably crazy, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to build that home I told you about, and I want to build it with you. I want to know what you look like when you laugh so hard you cannot breathe. I want to hear all your opinions about everything, even when we disagree. I want to sit with you for the rest of our lives, the way I sat with you through those 9 days, except in joy instead of fear. Will you marry me?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, Benjamin, I will marry you. But not because I feel obligated, and not because you saved my life, though that certainly did not hurt your case. I will marry you because in these past few days, getting to actually know you, I have felt more seen and more myself than I ever did in 23 years in Boston. You asked what I wanted from this life, and I think the answer is this: someone who sees me and chooses me anyway. I see you," he said softly, "and I choose you. Every time, Emma, I will always choose you." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony officiated by the Mormon bishop, with Sister Prudence and her husband standing as witnesses. Emma wore a dress borrowed from the boarding house owner's daughter, and Benjamin had bought a new shirt from the general store, the first new piece of clothing he had owned in 2 years. The ceremony was brief, but when Benjamin kissed his new wife for the first time, it felt like the sealing of a promise that went deeper than the words they had spoken. They spent their wedding night in the boarding house room, and Emma was still too weak for much beyond gentle kisses and whispered conversations, but neither of them minded. They had time now, all the time in the world, and there was something precious about the restraint, about learning to be married before the passion fully took over. In the days that followed, they made plans. Benjamin had money saved from his years of drifting, more than Emma would have expected from a hired gun who claimed to own nothing but his horse and his rifle. He had been frugal, he explained, because spending money required caring about something enough to want it, and he had not cared about much of anything in a long time. Now, though, they had a future to build. They decided to stay in southern Utah rather than chasing after the wagon train or heading to California. St. George was growing, and the surrounding area needed ranchers willing to put in the hard work of coaxing life from the unforgiving landscape. Benjamin used his savings to buy a parcel of land about 10 miles from town, 160 acres with a spring that ran year-round, rare and precious as gold in this country. They lived in a tent on the property while Benjamin built them a house, Emma helping as much as her still recovering strength would allow. It was hard work, brutal at times, with the sun beating down mercilessly and every nail and board requiring 3 times the effort it would have in an easier climate. But they did it together, and every wall they raised felt like a promise kept, another piece of the life they were building with their own hands. Sister Prudence visited often, bringing food and advice in equal measure, and through her, Emma began to integrate into the small community of St. George. The Mormon settlers were initially wary of outsiders, but Emma's determination to contribute, to be useful rather than decorative, gradually won them over. She helped with harvests, tended to sick children using skills she had learned from her mother, and participated in the communal efforts to maintain the irrigation systems that kept the town's gardens alive. Benjamin found work as a guide and occasional sheriff's deputy, skills that were always in demand on the frontier. But he was careful to take only jobs that would not keep him away from Emma for more than a few days at a time. He had spent too many years wandering to want to leave the home they were building. 6 months after their wedding, the house was finished. It was modest by the standards Emma had grown up with, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was solid and well built and entirely theirs. They furnished it slowly, making some pieces themselves and trading for others, each item chosen with care and purpose. Emma planted a garden, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the grudging soil, and Benjamin built a small barn for the horses and chickens they had acquired. Their first anniversary was celebrated quietly, just the 2 of them, and a meal Emma had spent all day preparing. After they ate, as the sun set and painted the desert in impossible colors, Benjamin pulled Emma onto the porch and into his arms. They swayed to music only they could hear, and he marveled at how much had changed in a single year. This woman in his arms had been a dying stranger when he first touched her, and now she was his wife, his partner, his home. "You ever regret it?" Emma asked, her head resting against his chest. "Staying with me, giving up your freedom." "Every single day," Benjamin said, and when she pulled back to look at him in hurt surprise, he was grinning. "I regret it every single day that I do not have you in my arms, which is to say, never. I have never once regretted choosing you, Emma." She swatted his chest but was laughing. "You are terrible. You know you scared me for a moment. I know, I could not resist." He kissed the top of her head. "What about you? Do you miss Boston or the life you might have had?" "The only thing I miss about Boston is my younger brother, and I am working on convincing him to come out here. As for the life I might have had, well, I would have been miserable." Thomas was a good man in his way, but he wanted a wife who would smile and nod and never have an opinion that contradicted his. You want a wife who argues with you about everything from how to build a fence to whether Shakespeare's comedies are actually funny. "They are not," Benjamin said. "They absolutely are. You just do not understand the humor. See, this is what I wanted. Someone who thinks I am wrong and is not afraid to tell me so." They stood together in the gathering darkness, and Emma felt a contentment that she had never imagined possible during her old life in Boston. She had been right to leave, right to risk everything for the chance at something real. And if she had needed to nearly die in the desert to find it, well, it had been worth every moment of that fever, every terrifying second of wondering if she would see another dawn. 2 years after they married, Emma discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with terror, as childbirth on the frontier was dangerous even for the healthiest women, and Emma still bore the scars of her near death from fever. But she was determined, and Benjamin was attentive to the point of obsession, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a dish rag for the entire pregnancy. Their son was born on a cool October evening, arriving squalling and healthy into the world with a full head of dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Benjamin's father, and the first time Benjamin held his son, Emma saw tears streaming down her husband's face. "I did not think I would ever have this," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "A family, a son. I thought that part of my life had died with my father and my sister. We get to start over," Emma said softly. "Both of us. We get to build something new from the ashes of what we lost." Samuel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Grace, and then 2 years after that by another son they called James. The house that had seemed adequately sized suddenly felt cramped, and Benjamin spent a summer adding on 2 more rooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch prospered in its modest way. never making them rich but providing enough to live comfortably and even save a bit for the children's futures. Emma's brother, David, did eventually make the journey west, settling in St. George and becoming a teacher at the small school the community had established. He met and married one of Sister Prudence's nieces, and their children grew up alongside Emma and Benjamin's brood, a new generation with no memory of the tragedies and constraints that had driven their parents to this harsh but beautiful land. The years passed in the way they do for happy families, marked by small joys and manageable sorrows, by children growing and learning, by the slow accumulation of memories that become the foundation of a life well lived. Emma never forgot those 9 days when she had hovered between life and death, when a stranger had refused to let her slip away. But they took on the quality of a story, something that had happened to different people in a different world. On their 10th anniversary, Benjamin took Emma back to the place where he had camped with her, the scrubby juniper tree and the small creek that had sustained them. The area had not changed much, still harsh and beautiful in equal measure, still the kind of place that tested everyone who tried to live there. "I almost gave up, you know," Benjamin said as they stood together in the shade of the juniper. "On the 7th day, when your fever was still climbing and you developed that terrible cough, I started to believe you were going to die, and I began to prepare myself for it." "What changed?" Emma asked. "You did. You opened your eyes and really saw me, and you thanked me, and I realized you were still fighting. So I decided I had to keep fighting too." Emma took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the unconscious ease of a decade of marriage. "Do you want to know what I remember most from those days?" "It was not the fever or the fear, though I remember those too. It was your voice. You talked to me constantly, telling me stories, telling me I had to hold on. Your voice was the thread I followed back to the world when it would have been so easy to just let go." "I needed you to live," Benjamin said simply. "Not because I knew you, or because I thought we might have a future together, but because I needed to believe that sometimes the universe lets good things survive, that not everything worth keeping gets taken away." They stood in silence for a while, remembering and being grateful. Then Emma said, "We should head back. Grace had a cough this morning, and I want to make sure it is nothing serious." The words sent a chill through Benjamin, the old fear never quite forgotten. But Emma squeezed his hand and smiled. "It is just a cough, my love. Not everything is a fever that nearly kills someone. Sometimes things are just what they are. I know, but I will always worry. I cannot help it. I would not want you to. Your worry is part of how you love, and I have never wanted you to love me less." They rode back to the ranch together, and Grace's cough turned out to be nothing more than dust irritation that cleared up in a day. Life continued its gentle, relentless march forward. When Benjamin turned 45, he made the decision to stop taking work that required him to leave the ranch for more than a day or two. He had money enough to focus entirely on the land and the livestock, and he wanted to be present for his children's remaining years at home. Samuel was already talking about heading further west to California, dreaming of the ocean and opportunities in San Francisco. Grace wanted to be a doctor, an ambition that seemed nearly impossible for a woman, but which Emma encouraged fiercely, remembering her own thwarted ambitions. James was still too young to know what he wanted, content to follow his father around the ranch and learn everything Benjamin could teach him. Emma, at 41, had become one of the most respected women in St. George. She served as an unofficial midwife and healer, her experiences with sickness making her both knowledgeable and empathetic. Women in difficult labors asked for her specifically, and more than one life was saved by her calm competence in crisis. She had found the purpose she had been seeking when she left Boston, had become someone who mattered in concrete and measurable ways. They celebrated their 20th anniversary surrounded by family and friends. The small house and yard overflowing with people who had become part of their extended community. Sister Prudence, now well into her 70s and still formidable, gave a speech about how she had known from the first moment she met them that they were meant to be together, conveniently forgetting her initial suspicions. David told embarrassing stories about Emma's childhood, and Benjamin's hired hands contributed tales of the boss's infamous stubbornness. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Emma and Benjamin found themselves alone on the porch once more, the same place they had stood on so many significant occasions over the years. The desert night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky in such profusion that it seemed impossible there could be any darkness left. 20 years, Emma said. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like yesterday that I was sitting with you in that camp, praying for your fever to break. Other days it feels like I have known you my entire life. Both can be true. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, a gesture so familiar it required no thought. I was thinking today about that woman I was, the one who collapsed in the dust. She would be astonished by this life, by you, by our children, by the fact that I actually became someone who matters. You always mattered, Benjamin said. That version of you was already brave enough to leave everything behind for a chance at something better. I just had the good fortune to be there when you needed someone. It was more than fortune. It was grace, or fate, or whatever name you want to give to the forces that bring two people together who are meant to find each other. They stood together in comfortable silence, and Benjamin thought about all the moments that had led to this one. If he had not been hired to guard that wagon train, if Emma had not gotten sick, if he had not made the choice to stay, if her fever had not broken when it did, everything would be different. Their children would not exist. This life would not exist. The weight of it was staggering, all the fragile chances that had aligned to create something solid and lasting. I love you, he said, not because it needed to be said, but because the feeling was so large in that moment it had to be given voice. I have loved you since the third day, when I realized I would do anything to keep you alive. And I will love you until the last breath leaves my body. Emma turned in his arms and kissed him, a kiss that held 20 years of kisses within it, that tasted of promises kept and sorrows shared and joys multiplied by being experienced together. When they finally pulled apart, she said, I love you too. And I am grateful every single day that you were stubborn enough to stay with me when any reasonable person would have ridden away. I was never reasonable. You should know that by now. Thank God for that, Emma said, and she was laughing as he kissed her again. The years continued to unfold. Samuel did eventually head to California, returning twice a year with stories of the city and the sea. He became a successful shipping merchant, marrying a woman named Claire and giving Emma and Benjamin 4 grandchildren they saw too rarely but loved fiercely when visits were possible. Grace defied every expectation and did become a doctor, studying back east and then returning to Utah to practice, one of the first female physicians in the territory. She never married, claiming her work was spouse enough, but she was clearly happy in a way that made Emma's heart swell with pride. James took over the ranch, marrying a local girl named Sarah, and raising his own family on the land his parents had built. Benjamin and Emma grew old together, their bodies weathering and wearing in the way bodies do, but their connection only deepening with time. They had arguments, some of them spectacular, because neither had ever learned to simply give in when they believed they were right. But they had far more laughter than fighting, more moments of quiet contentment than drama. On their 40th anniversary, Benjamin's hands shook too much to work with tools anymore, and Emma's joints ached in the cold, but they were still sharp-minded and engaged with the world. They sat on the same porch they had always favored, watching their grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the yard, a clan that had sprung from the choice a man had made 40 years ago to stay with a dying woman. "You remember what you told me?" Emma asked. "That first real conversation we had after the fever broke. You said life was too short to not be honest about what matters." "I remember." "Why?" "Because I have been thinking about what matters, and I have realized it is this. It is all of this. The moments we almost did not get because I almost died, the children we almost never had, the life we almost never built. Every single piece of it is precious because it was never guaranteed." Benjamin took her hand, their fingers gnarled now with age but the grip still strong. "We made something good, Emma, better than I ever dreamed possible when I was a young man running from everything that hurt. We did, and it started with you sitting with me for 9 days and refusing to let me go. Best decision I ever made." "Second best," she corrected with a smile. "The best was marrying me. You are absolutely right, as you so often are." They sat together as the sun set over the red cliffs, painting the world in the colors they had loved for 4 decades. The fever that had nearly killed Emma on the trail was a distant memory now, but the love it had sparked burned as bright as ever, a flame that had warmed them through the cold nights and harsh years of frontier life. Benjamin Harris had been a drifter, a man running from loss and connection. Emma Katherine had been a woman fleeing a life that would have slowly suffocated her. And on a dusty trail outside St. George, Utah, in the summer of 1873, they had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. 9 days of fever had bound them together, but it was the 40 years that followed, the daily choice to love and honor and build together, that had made them into something greater than they could have ever been apart. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Emma leaned her head on Benjamin's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for staying." "Always," he replied. "I will always stay with you." And he kept that promise for the rest of their long, love-filled lives. 2 souls who had found each other in the wilderness and created a home that would last for generations. The fever had nearly killed her, but it had also given her everything that mattered. In the end, that made all the difference.